Part 2, Art in the Borderland, Faith and Mimesis. The Via Crucis, or Stations of the Cross, are the stages that Jesus Christ underwent on the day of his crucifixion. Accordingly, these stages are the product of imitations. These are imitations that surface from the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, the sorrowful way or way of suffering, the processional route through which Jesus underwent his 14 stages. Now, even observing this picture here, acknowledges the route that Jesus undertook. This image here is probably still too contemporary to truly account for the actual route that Christ underwent. Nevertheless, if we're perceiving it in that sensory aspect, then we're finding us in a problematic stage. Instead, one has to perceive it in the idealistic sense. And it is true. It is a path that is as much historical as it is mythical. And despite it having been an occurrence, it is as impactful today as it was back then. And what is it that maintains that sense of impact? The sense of impact in this mimesis, in this Via Crucis, in this incredible, really, truly mass performance, right? It's almost like a theatrical act of sorts to reenact the Stations of the Cross. It's amazing how impactful it is for thousands of people. And on a worldwide scale, truly, millions of people. Now, this mural across the border at a humble chapel in the city of Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, it advises, "Haced lo que mi hijo os diga." Do what my son tells you. Now, interpretively, if one views it, and of course the mural, what it does is it does indicate the actual chapter and text of the Gospels, John, St. John. However, right, for maybe a person who is maybe not assertively invested in ideals of faith, would say, interpretively, is Christ acknowledged as the Son of Mary? Is it acknowledged as the Son of God? Right? Who's promoting the imperative here? Well, of course, one would have to argue that the imperative comes from God, so to speak, right? Or at least the perception of God, if one is not a faith-inclined individual. But one would have to ask, right? One has to say that why would masses of people listen, and why would they undergo a fictional Via Crucis? This is a path. This is a path that constitutes, a series of miles. It's out in the sun, and maybe for the youth it's not so bad. But the people who participate in this Via Crucis are people. Some are very elderly. Some are children. Some have health complications. Right? These are not things that one should simply seek out to ignore, so to speak, right? Well, so it involves the sun, depending on your health condition. You're trampling on the hardness of asphalt and dirt. It's not particularly the most ideal of Sunday mornings, right? I mean, if we're going to reenact, right, there's going to be a type of mimicry of the Via Crucis, then okay, well, here comes this sense of suffering. But even then, is such a sense of suffering truthful? So this act, it's repeated and followed citywide. Now, this particular observation from this chapel, there were hundreds of people, but there are hundreds more all across the city. There's I guarantee you, tens of thousands, right? Millions worldwide who are, if they enact the Via Crucis, they are partaking in this mimicry. Now, philosophically, during classical times, the iconic philosopher Plato, he was highly critical of this type of mimetic tradition. For Plato, the material world was not reality. The truth, Plato argued, consisted of ideas and form, for it is there that immutable and flawless modes of truth are able to manifest themselves. The arts for Plato was an illusion and imitation of true reality found in the mind. The artist then was limited to what the senses provided, right? So to repeat and to clarify this a little bit, Plato in a sense believed that his surroundings were a type of illusion. He didn't believe that the sensory, visceral, tangible, objective aspects of the world, he did not believe any of them to be truthful. He just believed that somehow in some unique way we're interacting with this illusory world by perception. And that the only truths, the only way to validate a type of truth is that which you could conceive idealistically, mentally, right, and via the framings of the mind. And it is the mind that in essence gave you the particularities of a truth. Now, to illustrate, consider the conception of courage. Is it possible to universally define the truth of courage in one objective and specific manner? This, of course, is going to be difficult to define by means of the senses or even physical attributes. Present in some visceral or auditory or even tangible sense. Instead, courage is something one simply knows by means of reason, by means of the mind. Now, this of course is what Plato is conceiving. This is what Plato is projecting. This is what Plato's attempting to get out there, right? If one says, look, here, this is what courage is. Well, universally, how does that project courage, right? Is courage limited to whatever that one marker is? Right? What would be the objective sensory physical attribution of what courage is? We can't really do it physically. And this is what Plato's getting at, right? How do we conceive of a universal notion on the truth of maybe virtues like courage or honesty? I mean, there's such diversity with that sense it's complex, right? There's a sense of notable complexity regarding that. Now, for Plato, such mimetic acts keep the artist from the truth, and perhaps he's not incorrect. If we look at this photograph here, right, and then you look at this image here, there's obviously a mimetic Christ there. Surely he bears the cross as much as Jesus of the gospel, right? So here we see the sense of truth of Plato. He's right in that the truth of a performance is entirely fictional, or at least in this interplace here, the Via Dolorosa, we're reshifting it from a cobblestone street to one of asphalt, one of dirt, of concrete, however it is you want to, describe the street marker of sorts. It's a reshifting. It's not the actual, but so why is it that as we participate in this, we're still invested in it? Well, we're still invested in it because of its ideal sense, and if you conceive of the philosophy of Plato, then you see it clearly at play here, right? So regardless of all the tangible, physical, intricate attributes of a performance, there's many questions that arise. Perhaps the red capes provide an acknowledgement of validity for Christ's Via Crucis. Part of a valid truth critique would be the time and environmental factors. And what about the idea of Jews? What about the combination of Jews and Gentiles, amicably bearing the grunt of these asphalt markers? Now recall that the Gentiles had not been acknowledged as of yet, at least not by scriptural validity. So no matter how intricate the Roman costumes are, again, They, in a sense, of an archetype of the I don't necessarily want to say the nemesis, right? But they're the ones who are enacting the law, right? They're a representation of the law. And we're not in Rome, so these are clearly not soldiers. They're a perceptive ideal of the Roman soldier. So regardless of the heat, the burdens of several miles walk, citizens of all ages, physical encompassings, and health demeanors, all of them undertake to integrate themselves onto the mimetic performance of Christ's stations. And again, I ask, why? This is clearly fictional, is it not? I mean, so that's something fascinating to conceive of, to ponder, to question, right? Well, did the participants integrate themselves to the extent of losing consciousness that this was, in fact, a performance, a mimetic parallel, if one will? Perhaps backpacks, caps, or the umbrellas. You see many of them there, right? Maybe those help inform about the fictional attributes. How is it that we're gaining consciousness that this act is not really a truthful act, and why, again, is it that we're so invested in it? In a sense, this mimetic representation is a copy. It's even a copy of a copy. There are indeed no primary sources here. It doesn't matter. Everybody participates, and regardless of all these contemporary markers, because of the idea. It is indeed an illusory spectacle. Up ahead are commercializing food carts. On the side, as viewers and observers pass by. After all, the passing of the Lord is quite a spectacle, is it not? Again, Plato's going to cringe, or would cringe, at the thought of Christ as an idea diminished. The scholar Juan Navarro here refers to Plato that such performances convey a destruction of human integrity, claiming it as a destruction because such an act is but a second nature type of habit, a yearly performance, if one will. After all, no one can truly mirror Christ's ordeal, regardless of the effort. If one take Plato's ideal, right, that of the form and of the idea of Christ, that is what is by far superior in its representation. By contrast, the actual sensory representation is diminished in the actuality of that superlative form. Is the performer here landing atop the cross to bear the hardships of the heated asphalt? Does such an act deem his performance unworthy? Notice the photographer that's there, right? It's almost like this is a noted scene. This is a noted part of the Stations of the Cross, right? How is it that we're so invested in this fiction? Well, we're so invested in it because the idea transcends the physical. That's pretty amazing, don't you think? Again, in thinking of Plato, a critique of these mimicry-based enactments, they are irrelevant because it is the ideal, a divine ideal, if you will, as noted here, that grants the deed authority. So Christ, no matter in what mimetic representation, it's the idea of Christ that transcends all physical markers, and that's indeed very unique. So what precisely is it that deems such a performance enriching, transforming, transcendent? What precisely is it that deems it persuasive enough to convince hundreds, at least in this Via Crucis and across the city, thousands, all across the city to partake in such an act? The idea of the Via Crucis, no matter how realistic one interprets it, is indeed flawed in revealing the truth. It's literally impossible in any sense. But it is that transcendent ideal which surpasses the sensory real. Participants can partake of concessionary goods because the act is in itself flawed. And that's why maybe why many people feel comfortable partaking in acquiring some type of concession. Of course, you're going to have some purists that might avoid them, but some are going to say, well, I have the acknowledgement that the physical, right, the tangible, the auditory, all of this is secondary to the notion, the idealistic notion of Christ's Stations of the Cross. And in synchronizing it with this ideal, it then becomes more relevant. It becomes more meaningful and perhaps even truthful, depending on one's faith conceptions. Christianity today exists because the idea exists, and it transcends by means of writing, by means of painting, and performances alike. Here's an act that is surely not the act, but instead promotes an ideal. So Christ's crucifixion then is an archetype representation of sacrifice, right? And again, even if it's not the actual act, in the witnessing of this Via Crucis, one is transcending time, one is transcending space. And as here, again, it's that representation of sacrifice. It's also a representation of rebirth. And ultimately, it's a representation of love itself. So here we have the painting Ecce Homo by Murillo on display at the El Paso Museum of Art. And it's a representation of Pilatus' famous statement, "Behold the man," which is a reference to Jesus, in that acknowledgement to crucify Christ, or the pre-crucifixion of Christ. The crown of thorns, of course, in the humble reads, it serves as a reminder of the ridicule that Christ underwent in accordance with the narrative of the Gospels. Again, this is the ideal that's trying to be transcended. It's not the actuality of the ordeal. And this is noted. And this is noted both in the Via Crucis and Via Crucis and any representations of this notion of faith in the Borderlands. Like the magical realism of the murals at Lincoln Park, there is that transcendent essence of magical realism on display here. There's a representative sculpture of Christ, and it surpasses the coarse landscapes of a rather not so artistic graffiti background. Banksy is certainly not on display here. After the morning session of the Via Crucis, there is an evening representation known as Via Lucis, Way of Light, or Stations of the Resurrection, in commemoration of Christ's resurrection. Again, if one observes the background, one might say, "Oh dear," right? This is maybe not the most idealistic of the Via Lucis, commemoration. But again, that's if we focus on the physical, right? And again, it's the idea that surpasses that. And this is true of any performance. It doesn't have to be necessarily faith-based. But what's unique to the Borderland is that this notion of faith, it's highly prominent. Here's another image also on display at the El Paso Museum of Art, one of Madonna and Child by Andrea Previtali, Italian, and it's representative and idealistic for various reasons. Amongst them is, of course, the Immaculate Conception, and it promotes the idea of hope. Now, this idea of the Immaculate Conception, right? There's no contemporary proofs of any Immaculate Conception. So again, you notice the notion of an idealistic projection transcending everything. So 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 that representation there is very much on par with also performances. And from that hopeful birth to the aftermath of Christ's death is the truth of that hope, as illustrated here by Raphael in the resurrection of Jesus Christ in 1502. And it is this resurrection note that best helps interpret the Via Lucis. And again, if you observe the image, highly idealistic. The angels are there, the angels are there hovering amidst the sky. Christ is floating honorably high above with the representative flag of Christianity. Once again, we're noting a very clear ideal. Again, focus on the sensory is not rational. There's no reason here. I mean, this is not the most idyllic of landscapes, right? We're not gifted with witnessing Christ's resurrection, but we are gifted with the form and idea of his resurrection. Similarly, Mary, the beloved saintly mother, is the ideal archetype of faith. So how is it that the sculpture here, right, again, it surpasses that which is visually representative, and it surpasses it, right, as an ideal of faith, and it also surpasses it amidst the landscape, right, the coarse landscape in the background. Nevertheless, she's that archetype of love. She's that archetype of obedience. And she's indeed the most famous and canonized of saints in Latin America. And if you notice, right, as in the Via Crucis, the masses follow those representative markers. And that's simply the image itself, right? They're not just following these sculptures. They are in essence following the idea that these sculptures represents. Right? As in the Via Crucis, the masses follows. They follow that notion, that representation of what it means to give some reference to the archetypal figure of Christ, to the archetypal figure of Mary. Right? Both of them, notably, are a type of mimicry. They're a type of mimesis. For all of these archetypal symbols that you can attribute to them, right? Christ, right? He's the ultimate archetype of perfection, of love, rebirth, of sanctity for all. Again, even if you don't subscribe to faith, right? He is still ultimately the ultimate hero, right? She is still the ultimate notion of the perfect mother, right? Mary is that mimicry. She's not just a sculpture, right? She's that idealistic, the idea behind the sculpture. Christ is the idealistic notion, the savior of humanity, right? The ultimate hero, that notion of perfection. And it is indeed in this notion that the idea of faith is embodied in the Borderland. And it's true. Faith is conceived of worldwide. But for whatever reason, there's a constancy of faith, on corners in the here, corners in the there, right? And the Via Crucis doesn't just take place in Juarez. The Via Crucis is something. The Via Crucis and the Via Lucis are not just things that take place in Juarez. They are performances that take place in the here and there of the borders, back and forth. In the churches there, in the churches here, in the churches all around. Right? It's this notion of hope, of whether you're an immigrant or whether you're a citizen, of whatever you're dealing with certain ordeals. And we can even parallel this to maybe notions of the superhero concept when superheroes die, right? Maybe forgive the silly reference here, but if you think of one of the Avengers movies where one of the heroes dies and people get very emotional. Why do they get emotional? Obviously, the actors are not really truly dying, but it's the idea that they're selling, right? The idea that they're promoting, the idea that they're projecting. And in some magical, unique, fascinating way, that idea is noted as true. And that is the sense in which faith is certainly projected prominently within the Borderland.